Welcome back to This Week. I'm Somna Sambo. The Minister of Power, Saleh Mamman, has directed the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission to inform all electricity distribution companies to revert to tariffs that were applicable in December 2020. The minister spoke against the backdrop of reports that electricity tariffs had been increased by 50%. Mamman said that these measures were all aimed at cushioning the effects of the pandemic while providing more targeted interventions for citizens. The Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission had earlier denied approving an increase in electricity tariff across the country. Well, for analysis on this, let's turn to Engineer Michael Oluwagbemi, the executive partner of LoftyInc, a private company. Good to have you, Michael. All right, now let's take a look at this policy flip-flop and reversal. What do you make of it? Because a lot of Nigerians are actually confused on this directive and counter-directive on these tariffs.
Yeah, I think there's a need for proper coordination by the rulemaking agency and its supervisory ministry, in this instance the NERC and the Ministry of Power. However, we also have to be very clear that there was a lot of misinformation when the initial publishing by the media houses that there were some increases by 50% there. I don't think that's even possible in this scenario. 50% increase was not and could never have been what was being explored, considered, or even applied by any disco in any of the bands that we have talked about. That would have meant paying 75 naira per kilowatt hour at the highest band level, and that's not the case. I think that's aside, and I think a few media houses that had reported 50% increase withdrew it. I also think that the NERC should have not just gone by the letter of the law, which is a biannual review that we all should expect going forward, but should also consider the ongoing economic situation of the country and taking the advice of their supervisory ministry, irrespective of their own independence. And let's be clear that the NERC is supposed to act as an independent arbiter in the power sector, but there's also political consideration to its work as an agency of the federal government of Nigeria, and I think there could have been a better coordination to be able to determine when to apply the biannual review, which is now part of the policy mechanism for regulating prices in the downstream power sector. I think that lack of coordination is what you saw briefly, where the NERC was considering a 2 naira to 4 naira band adjustment at A, B, C, but of course leaving C, D, and E, the lowest tariff levels, intact. The A, B, and C adjustments will have ranged between 2 naira and 4 naira, and if you used to pay, that would have been an average of 3 naira based on forex and input price increases that had been experienced in the last 6 months. That was referring to the original tariff order of August. What the minister have come out to say is that because the August order was suspended and the federal government entered negotiation with Labour that sought the downward review of the pricing that was then applied in November, then the biannual review cannot start from January. You will have to take into consideration the ongoing negotiation and engagement with Labour, with the view of increasing the overall understanding of how the free market mechanism has been supposed to work in the downstream power sector. So I think the position of the minister is correct. I think the right thing is to start counting any kind of price adjustment from after when the negotiation and review mechanism with Labour had been concluded, which will be the end of this month. And then that will be the final sign-off on that policy. And that policy will then resume, and then you can do your biannual review at the middle of this year and the end of this year. I think, or something of that nature. I mean, I don't want to predetermine or guess what they will finally agree on, but clearly there was need for political guidance. And I always say, politics precedes policy, and policy precedes projects. And you have to, in a political environment, when you are implementing technical activities, you must take into cognizance the political consideration, which in this instance has to prevail. The Minister of Power, the Supervisory Minister, has already given his guidance, and I think the NERC will have to abide by that guidance.
In other words, what you are saying right now is that this is just a temporary relief because it's eventually going to be increased from that 2 naira to 4 naira. And then also a lot of persons, including the discos, have said that the NERC's powers have been whittled down by a lot of political influence, and as a result of that, it should be scrapped. What do you think of that very strong comment that NERC should be scrapped due to political interference?
Oh, well, I mean, your interpretation when I said it's temporary, the freeze is temporary. Of course it is temporary. The minister did mention that he wants any kind of freeze only after the conclusion of the price review mechanism regime with labor, which would conclude at the end of the month. I believe an agreement was in place to review how pricing is done from the NERC perspective in 60 days. And of course that went into the holidays from November or through the holidays, and now it will conclude at the end of January. So any policy, including this new tariff regime, would only have to come into effect after that is done. But it doesn't have to be an increase of 2 naira to 4 naira. The 2 naira to 4 naira was based on technical measurements that were done by NERC over the last 6 months, starting in August. What the minister is saying is that you freeze that, you discard that, essentially, and start your measurement and your recommendation based on the conclusion with labor and engagement with labor and conclusion of how the policy mechanism for tariff will go at the end of January. So it might not be an increase of 2 naira to 4 naira. It may even be a decrease of 2 naira to 4 naira if suddenly the economic situation does change. I mean, let us remember that we cannot continue to think like communists and expect capitalist outcomes. As a country, we have to understand that if we want the free hand of the market and to benefit from the free hand of the market, which includes investment in our electricity sector, then we'll have to be able to subject ourselves to free market principles. And one of the issue around free market principles is that price does change, and price can change upwards and price can change downwards. We've seen that in the area of the deregulation of petroleum products. We've had increases in the last 3 months, and we've had occasion where the government actually cut the price from PPRA. So you have to be willing to go with the dynamism of the market rather than depending solely on just price fixes that makes no sense or that becomes obsolete very quickly and then destroys investment in the sector. We cannot on one hand be complaining about lack of investment in the sector and then also insist that you do not want the free market principles of price adjustments when it is necessary should actually take place. And that takes me to your second question around NERC being scrapped, as some people have suggested. I will assume those people who are suggesting this are people who have maybe an axe or two to grind with NERC. There's no, I personally am not saying the NERC have been a perfect adjudicator in the marketplace or is the most effective. I've been on this program in the past to criticize the ineffectual nature of NERC when it comes to disciplining market operators, especially the discos. But I also think that a market where you do not have regulator is a market that no investor is willing to participate in. And yes, some people have said that the NERC is experiencing some high level of political interference, and that is only natural when you're about to get a regulator off the ground. I think, if you recall that the CBN, one of the oldest regulators in Nigeria, was still very much subject to a lot of political influences, even up to the 10, 20 years ago. But as the institution ages and the institution matures, a child cannot crawl before it actually stands, and cannot walk before it crawls. So you must go through stages. So NERC is a relatively young institution. It's trying to find its foot, and so naturally it still needs some critical political guidance. But its existence is a positive thing for the sector, and I think it would be negative if you're trying to scrap it just because there's political interference. And now you're going to subject the sector to full-blown political interference where prices are set because the minister thinks it should be at this price or the other price. Rather, it should be a process of technical evaluation as it is today. NERC came up with that 2 naira to 4 naira figure for band A, B, and C. Potentially, they had not fixed a specific pricing for each of those bands because that specific pricing will be determined at your disco level. So it might be 2 naira 10 kobo for somebody in Yola for band A, for example, and it can be 3 naira 10 kobo for somebody in Lagos, depending on your disco, because it's based on specific conditions and specific market conditions that is prevailing in your market, like pricing of labor, pricing of the gas fuel, pricing of different pricing, including forex impacts on the pricing. So that is an outcome of a technical assessment by a technical body like NERC. It should not be an outcome of a political consideration where a minister will be heading into an election and decide to cut prices, and then right after the election decide to double it. So the absence of NERC will be worse than the presence of a politically influenced NERC as we have today, which is not only natural, I repeat, when an institution is only trying to find its feet. But it's time for us to let it work, and I think over a period of time it will work.
Take a look at some of the subsidies being paid by the Nigerian government, which a lot of persons, including the World Bank, keep disturbing the government all about. About 55% of the hungry consumers in bands D and E actually enjoy subsidy. Actually, subsidy that is about 55% being paid by the Nigerian government to those between band D and E. And then recently, I'm aware also that those between bands A, B, and C in October 2020 were given some partial subsidies. What do you make of these subsidies being paid by the Nigerian government, and how soon do you foresee the government pulling out of paying those subsidies, or will it just continue indefinitely?
No, I don't think it will continue forever, but it is not unusual even in the most developed climes in the world that poorer people's power should be subsidized. To be honest, it's only a factor. It's primarily for us in our condition. I think what we've done is to peg that subsidy to the level of consumption. So folks that are in band D and E, for example, are probably folks that have 1 light bulb or 2 light bulbs. So if you look at the end user consumer level subsidy, it's probably ends about 30-40 naira per month from the government to such persons. And I don't think that is outrageous. Different countries have different industrial and economic policy, and I think it's a good thing if we are subsidizing production, and a lot of this power will go into producing, even at the most basic rural level. If you consider a village that doesn't have power, for example, then it's a nighttime economy shuts down at 4 or 5 o'clock. So the government benefits if you are able to release subsidy in under band D and E to that village at 30-40 naira per person, and they are able to have power set up until 9-10 o'clock, and then they have the economy, nighttime economy, suddenly boost the GDP, and the government can take in more taxes, and the places can be more developed. So the government actually benefits from giving that subsidy. So I don't think it's a bad thing that subsidy should exist based on economic class. All over the world, there are what we call a social safety net for poor people, and I think this is just a practice of some form of social safety net. I do not buy into just the pure Washington consensus principles that all forms of public sector subsidies have to be removed in order for economy to grow. That's not even the experience of developed country, be it the Western Europe or United States of America. They have substantial subsidy in place or economic incentives for poorer people so that they can move up in the economic ladder. So I think it's fine. The question for us is, how do we move people rather quickly from band E to D to C to B to A? That's really the question for everybody in the power sector. And one of the biggest factors of that is how many hours do you actually get electricity? If you have more electricity between above 20 hours, you become a band A. So why are we not giving more people electricity above 20 hours in band C and B so that they can be pushed into band A? I think that should be the question for every disco. To me, that should be what we should be going after, not trying to remove the subsidy as such, but moving people because you have given them more power into the higher band level, and as a result, you are able to increase the economic activity and economic production in the country. And you can only do that because you've, one, provided the power, two, you've metered the power so that you can collect.
I'm afraid we do not have enough time. Michael Oluwagbemi, a power analyst, talking to us about the recent electricity tariff issues in Nigeria. Thanks so much for being on the show, and we'll just want to go on a very short break right now. When we return, we'll continue with the issues we have here. Stay with us.